All right. Good morning. We'll go ahead and get started. Welcome to class two. And I'm just, by the time everyone leaves, the workbook for today will be I'm realizing it's not already there, but that's not particularly important until you go home. Um, so for each of these classes, as we said before, on the event page that you've all seen to get here, at the very bottom, there's a link that says course materials, and there will be a workbook, a 2 week, because this class meets every 2 weeks. So there'll be a 2 week workbook if you want to take a look at it. It helps to integrate what we talk about in each class before the next class. But as I said in the first class, I don't call on anybody. No one's going to know if you don't look at it. So, but it's helpful, I think, if you want to. It's just at the very, very bottom of the event page in the calendar, and it will always be there um, at some point. All right. So this is a 12-week course. And if you missed the first class, it's on our YouTube channel. You can find it. Just go to the tnlsf.org, the top left, go to our YouTube channel. You can find it there. So it's the second of 12 classes. And we talked about in the first class how the central theme, we're going to cover a lot of ground in 12 classes, but the central theme of the course as a whole is to reflect on what is the model of, as you can see here kind of on the screen, what we talked about before in the first class. We introduced the model of happiness and meaning and fulfillment that we are kind of given by society, by our culture, by our interpersonal development, which is to rearrange external conditions, to do our best to, have the right job, have the right relationship, go to the right school, make enough money, to rearrange external conditions in a way that feels safe, that feels supportive, that feels comfortable. And that we described that in the first class as the outside in model, where we're looking outside of ourselves, we're externalizing sources of happiness, contentment, purpose, meaning. And we looked at how, because we have very little control over most of that, and ultimately we have less and less control as we age and we get closer to the end of our lives, and things can shift in dramatic ways without, pandemics and so on, that are completely outside of our control. We talked about how that there's an inside out model that's more stable, where we're actually trying to cultivate inner qualities, inner states of mind, and rely on those instead of only deciding that I can be happy, that I can be content, that I can be satisfied, that I can feel that I have a life of meaning when I've been able to arrange things that are outside of myself for brief periods of time in the ways that seem useful. Um, so that's the through line that we're going to keep coming back to over the course of the 12 weeks. And in today's class, as it says here, the focus is going to be in understanding in more detail in today's class why the outside in model is not only is it kind of unreliable, but it's impossible by its nature. It's not something, you could say it's a fool's. I mean, we can look at that in different ways, in terms of, we looked at it kind of through the lens of impermanence being one way in which it becomes difficult. But we're going to understand more through today's class how, because of the nature of oneself, the nature of external phenomenon, um, it can't ever really be successful. It's fundamentally a premise that can't give us what we want. And the more that we stick with that, and don't make a shift, don't make a change, the more disappointed, the more frustrating, the more painful our experiences will be. But of course, we have this other inside out model that we're going to be replacing over the course of, so we're not just saying this doesn't work. Oh, well, we're going to look at this is what we've inherited through our culture, through our upbringing. And then we're going to say, well, what's a better way of going about it? What's more reliable? What's more workable? And how do we actually make progress on that? So we're going to see how um, what we got a glimpse of was that happiness in the first class, we got a glimpse of the fact that happiness can't really be findable in external conditions. So then, of course, we're left with, where do we find it? And we discovered, that in our own direct experience, relying on that model isn't the best. And now we're going to really look at the reason for that. The most fundamental reason for that is because of the nature of phenomenon, the nature of ourselves as a phenomenon, and the nature of everything outside of ourselves as a phenomenon. Okay, so when we look at these two models, the inside out and the outside in, they are talking about two different, you could say, two different worlds, right? We have the internal world of our own subjective experience, our own, what we bring to all of our interactions, our thoughts, our priorities, our values, our life experience, the things that we've learned, that we are familiar with, the things that we enjoy, the things that we dislike, the whole history of the sum total of our experiences. And that is our inner landscape. And we carry that into every act of cognizing that which is outside of ourselves. And that's the outer world, right? So, what, and this class is, we're not going to go into the same level of depth in this particular philosophical topic as you find in historical Buddhist sources. But really, there's tremendous overlap between what we will be talking about in today and then coming back to, and kind of the central premise of what the Buddha taught, which is looking at how we as sentient beings, as thinking, cognizing, perceiving beings, create the reality of our lives, and more importantly, how we don't take responsibility for that process. How we don't really analyze. We kind of go through one of the through lines in the course is the disconnect between reactivity and subconscious and unconscious drives, and moving into a more intentional, more conscious way of cultivating rather than just reacting. And the Buddha's insight on this is, really ultimately what he's trying to get everybody to see, and his whole path of training is leading people to see that not only do we actively construct our ego identity and we actively construct our way of thinking about everything around us, but we don't really understand that we are doing that. We think that we are passively receiving information. We think that we're just noticing what's true, and that there is no active creation. There is no, we're not bringing anything into our cognizing, our perceiving, our relating. And that disconnect from the Buddhist standpoint is the primary reason why we suffer. If we could understand that that's what's happening and take responsibility for it and begin to move in this more intentional direction, then things would still be difficult. We would still experience challenge, but the additional layer of real, like personal, painful suffering experience is something that we could work with more and more effectively. Um, so one entry point, as it's pointing here, one entry point into understanding this is to recognize that the subconscious, unconscious, uncritical, or unanalyzed perspective that we have of I'm just a passive receiver of information, that I'm just noticing what is true, what is valid, what is being broadcast to me about the world. One way of recognizing that that's not true is all of the times when we experience that we and someone else seem to be relating to the same external event, but having completely different views about that external event, right? There's an artist, a musical artist that we couldn't live without. There's a favorite book or a favorite movie or a favorite food, right? And we know people who have watched that movie, who've eaten that food, who've read that book, and they're just like, this is terrible. Like, what are you talking about? This food is awful. This author doesn't know what they're talking about. This music is noise. It's discordant. It's awful. How could you listen to country music? How could you listen to reggae? How could you listen to, rock and roll, whatever it is? I like classical music. I'm not a sweets person. Chocolate is disgusting. All of these things. So the more that we can think about how prevalent that is in our experience, the easier it will be to recognize, well, wait, there's nothing different about the book, about, the chocolate, about the music. What's different is what I'm bringing to my experience of that object and what the other person is bringing to their experience of that object. And that is different. My history, what I've learned from my parents, my upbringing, you know, what I was taught, what I was exposed to, the experiences that I had, shaped how I relate to those things. And other people were raised differently, had different reactions, maybe different fear responses around certain experiences, different, associations with family traditions that made something look pleasant or unpleasant, what have you. And that is responsible for why me and they look at objectively the same object. It's same number of words are in the same order, but we relate to it in a completely different way. So this interplay between the subjective experience of ourselves as a sentient being and the outer world, when we mistakenly believe that we are just a valid receptacle of that which is being broadcast by the world, and that we don't bring anything to that process, that it's not an interactive process, then that's a level of confusion about what's true that it's going to get us into trouble over the course of our lives. So correcting that misunderstanding about how perception, how cognition works, is really incredibly beneficial in many, many ways. And in terms of historical traditional Buddhist philosophy, which isn't the mainstay of this particular, we have many, many other classes where that is the emphasis. This is a bit broader of a course, but really very much the same idea that is taken to even a deeper level. If you're like, oh, this is really interesting, then Tibetan Buddhism is a place where this is explored in exquisite detail for years of potential study. Um, okay, any thoughts or questions so far before we go into? Since the most June's ever heard me speak in 5 years, I think. It happens. It just only happens in classes. So we're going to look at an example of what I mean of this, just using flowers are often in Buddhism the analogy, I think, because they're kind of a rich object in terms of all of their different parts, right? So here's just an example of a sunflower. So if we are just out in the world and we see a field of sunflowers, if we relate this to analyzing or not analyzing, we're just going to look at it with our eye consciousness and say sunflower, out there in the field. However, when we bring more analysis, when we bring more thought to it, what gave rise to the sunflower? And this, what we're going to go, broaden this example, but of course, the sunflower depends on sun, soil, rain, air, a lack of, salt in the field, a lack of, other kind of pesticides and things. And then most importantly, it depends upon our subjective experience of looking at it and saying sunflower, right? We have to have, as a group of sentient beings, we have to all agree on what it is. We have to have a shared language, a shared understanding. Because if I say, well, that's a car, and you say, well, no, that's a school bus, we're lost, right? We've developed a shared way of looking at what functions do things serve, and then we just make up words. And we say that's a chair, and that's a stool, and that's a cushion, and that's a sunflower, and it's just thousands of years of human society needing to be able to make sense of our world and talk about things in a way that allow us to build things and get to places at the same time and be productive and organize and do shared labor. We're kind of out of necessity had to develop a shared understanding of the world. So if someone looked at that and said, well, it is a car, well, then that person, we would say, might have some sort of mental health, condition. They're hallucinating in some way. But the Buddha says we're all hallucinating. We're just all in agreement about what we're hallucinating about. And the person who is the outlier who's saying it's a car, they're just really hallucinating. They're just beyond the normal. They're sort of a normal level of hallucination, and then there's a pathological level. But even the normal level is problematic compared to true wisdom, compared to really critically analyzing. So when we apply this idea of analysis, then what we would say is, well, sure, there is something, we're not in the matrix. We're not actually, Buddhism wouldn't say that it is not true that there isn't external, that there isn't things outside, because it's a little bit more, well, yeah. So Buddhism acknowledges, that there is an external world. It's true. But the idea of that this is a sunflower, when we just see it and the mind, just the label of sunflower just appears to the mind, and we just really think that that is objectively a sunflower. It is not a rose, it is not a car, it is not a chair, it is a sunflower. What we're not doing is really because it would be exhausting, right? If we try to do this but to some degree, that's kind of the work. I mean, if you think about the thousands of things in this room that we're all labeling. Each time we look at the clock, we look at a book, we look at a painting, we look at a chair, we look at the rug, and it's just rug, chair, painting, that just these labels. And so we're overwhelmed by external phenomenon. And so we kind of have to narrow that down, and we kind of have to relate to the world through labels, right? Otherwise, I mean, it would be I can't do anything other than that, right? It's possible, I guess, because certainly there, through incredible amounts of meditative training, seems to be that you can get there, but it's not going to happen soon. It's not going to happen quickly. But so it's not like we're doing anything wrong or bad. It's kind of a necessary convention for existing in the world to experience the world on the basis of the labels that we've assigned culturally, societally, to all of the things that we deal with. But what is true is that the sunflower is that which exists in dependence upon all of the coming together of these causes and conditions. So here, is another way of looking at the sunflower, right? All of the different parts of it. And then you've got the watering can, the sunlight, the soil. Um, if we came upon this in a field, would we say that's a sunflower? It's all of the same parts. They're just arranged a little bit differently, right? They're kind of dissected. They're kind of, spread apart. It doesn't perform the function of a sunflower. So we probably wouldn't say it's a sunflower. But all of the same causes and conditions are still present in either case, right? And so what you can do then is to think about, as it says here, if you had a physical sunflower and you took off one petal and you had the one petal in one hand and everything else in the other hand, do you still have a sunflower? It's not identical to when it was just the one, but then you do it again and then you do it again. At what point, if you look at, at what point would you say that this hand is something and this is no longer holding what I started with? Or you could take a car and you could take off the door handle, or one whole door, or just the front bumper or the back bumper, or the roof. At what point does it go from car to not car? At what point does it go from sunflower to not sunflower? And when you do this kind of imaginative exercise, and you think about all of the causes and conditions that went into what I was just labeling as sunflower, you start to see how it never really was a sunflower, right? It isn't that it stopped being a sunflower. It's just that I stopped relating to it in the way that my label, my active process of creating the sunflower shifted at some point. And so, we can do this. So ultimately, we see that all of these causes and conditions, like sunlight, like soil, like rain, the seed, the lack of toxin, and so on, the final one is my own act of labeling, my own act of what they would call in Buddhism mental imputation, giving the label of sunflower to that which I cognize, to that which I observe. And so, in any of these ways, the label can shift or fail when we think about it differently. So, what's more impactful then is to think about how this analysis is relatable to oneself. Um, so, we, like sunflowers, are the product of causes and conditions coming together. We are not just in the same way that the sunflower is not this thing out there that we're cognizing passively, that we're just observing, that's having some sort of essence of sunflower-ness being broadcast to us. We too exist on the basis of the coming together of causes, conditions, and experiences. Um, and these are just some ways of thinking about that. If we could have just been born just in the same parents, same just in a different country, we would end up differently because that country has a different educational system, and that country has a different set of laws and norms and social etiquette, and that would shape who we were. Take everything except the country of origin, and we'd be different. Take everything except the time. If we had been born 10 years earlier, 10 years later, the world is different based on global events, our proximity to war, our proximity to, famine and social disruption would be different. And that impacts how people treat each other and how they raise their children. Um, just change the schools that you grew up in, just change the neighborhood, really. Think of the impact of the children in your elementary school and how they related to you, whether that went well or that didn't go well, or, and all of these experiences. We would be a fundamentally different person on the basis of changes in that experience. So, but that's not really, but again, we don't really think about that. We just think this is who I am. This is kind of unavoidably. But what that can lead to then is the belief that I can't be other than what I am right now. And that is kind of where this is leading, is one of the things that's really valuable about this way of thinking. One of them is to recognize that if I am a construction, just like everything else is a construction, then I can choose to be constructed differently in the future. I can choose to move in a different direction and become something other than what I am. So I don't feel, because this uncritical way of relating can lead to a feeling of being stuck, feeling like this, oh, I've always been like this, it can only be like this, this is who I am. Like, just I'm powerless about who I am. And we can take that back by recognizing that there are so many things that led to who I am today. And if I start to take responsibility for those fundamental shaping influences, then in 10 years, I can be very different than who I am right now. Um, okay. So again, this is talking about the importance of language. And you could also just think of labels, right? The importance of language and labels in this process. When we observe someone who meets our needs, we think of that person as a friend. When we think of someone who we haven't interacted with and they're just kind of in the background, we think of them as a stranger. Or we think of ourselves as being, well, I'm a shy person, or I'm, extroverted, or I'm good at this, or I'm bad at this, or I find this difficult, I find this easy. These are all mental imputations. These are mental labels, right? They are not findable in the object. They are ways of thinking, right? There's nothing about a person who seems to be, when we observe someone who meets our needs, then we think, well, I should also meet their needs, right? I should also look out for them. They're looking out for me. I should look out for them. We have a friendship, right? But that's just one way of thinking. We could think, well, every sentient being is deserving of my care in exactly the same way as someone who's looking after me. There's no reason why I should reserve my care for someone who would be in the quote unquote stranger category. So all of these are just ways of thinking. These are just chosen or inherited, not even necessarily chosen, because again, there's so much subconscious, uncritical, unexamined stuff that's going into these labels. Um, yeah. So, as I said, this is unavoidably how we must navigate the conventional world, but they can also keep us stuck. They can keep us from change. They can keep us from seeing things in a different way. And here the example is, well, some people look at a sunflower, they think, oh, that's so beautiful. It's golden and it's radiant. But if you're a gardener, and you're like, this is invading my garden and it's threatening, then you're going to look at it as a weed or as something to remove or, something that you want to get rid of. In the same way, you could look at a chocolate cake and think, oh, I can't wait to have this after dinner. Someone could be fatally allergic to chocolate and they're like, I need to keep this poison. I need to have this awareness. Like it can't touch anything that I eat. Like, where is it at all times? Right? Same object, completely different mental labels, depending upon what's important to that person, what their values are, what they're trying to accomplish. Um, so the words that we use and the way that we think about things is incredibly important. Yeah. So what we're trying to understand is that everything that we're talking about is just a habit. It's just what we've been doing. It's just kind of what our culture, what our society, what our life has been like, what we've been reinforcing, over the course of however many decades we've been alive, right? But these habits are not fixed. These habits are something that we can do. We can choose how to relate. We can choose not to assent to these labels and give them the same level of power that they have. We can choose to see things differently. Um, we're not, there's nothing about reality that demands that we engage with it in this way. We can choose a different way. Okay, right. So coming then back to this central question of how this relates to where does happiness, where does meaning, where does purpose come from? The model that we've absorbed from our society, the outside in model, is based on the idea that I am separate, that I must go through life pulling in everything I find pleasant and pushing out everything I find unpleasant because I'm separate from everything else. Everything has its own fixed identity, as pleasant or unpleasant, from its own side. That's just the nature of things. So I have no choice, right? I'm powerless but to amass what I find pleasant and to push away what I find unpleasant. Um, because everything is fixed and stable and Buddhism would use the word intrinsic or inherent to the phenomenon, and so all I can do is depend upon constructing externalities. But when we think in this way of everything being constructions, then constructions are fluid, they're dynamic. Different causes and conditions can be assembled internally and in terms of, most importantly, in terms of our minds, how we relate to things. We can bring different things to bear in our relationships with external conditions. And then recognize that because we are wrong, we are fundamentally wrong about the nature of things, we will always fail if we rely on the outside in model. um, it's fundamentally impossible to be successful. Okay. So we've reached the small group discussion portion of today's class. I did promise the people that are new, you have a solemn guarantee to never have any role playing, but there are small group discussions that, and if you want to go and read, you do whatever, but we do have small group discussions in every class. Okay. Right. So we'll move into the meditation then. So just sit comfortably. Mainly, we want to think about a stable posture. So, not slouching, not leaning, just letting the body settle. Begin to let go of attending to the environment, allowing sights and sounds to be as they are. No need to investigate. Moving your awareness inward, constraining it to the body and mind. Letting go of thoughts of the past, plans for the future. Nothing to do. Concentrating that awareness in the present by attending closely to the physical sensation of the air as it moves into and back out of the tip of the nostrils. Giving yourself the instruction to notice quickly anything other than that one physical sensations arising in the mind. And then without judgment or frustration to lift your awareness up from those distractions and to place it gently but firmly again and again on the breath. In this week's meditation, we're going to follow a thread similar to in the first meditation, where we followed the thread of how we search for happiness. But in this meditation, we're going to follow the thread of causes and conditions. So think of this room. How did it come to exist? Think of the people who must have built it, the ways in which they must have gathered the materials. Think of the land on which it's situated and the history of that land. Think of all of the people stretching back perhaps hundreds of years, shaping the environment, making decisions. All of that resulted in this space being able to be here. Try to bring to mind that complexity and sit with it. Begin to apply that way of thinking to yourself. What had to be happen? What had to happen for it to be possible for you to be here? Not only the logistics of today, your choice to be here and not somewhere else, that specific interest. Think what shaped your interest in these questions. A teacher, a book, a conversation. And trace this thread back. Notice how quickly that leads to people, to events entirely outside of your control, to things that happened before you were even old enough to choose. And keep going back. The language that you are thinking in, where did that come from? The beliefs you hold most deeply, the stories that you have about yourself and your capacity. Trace those back. I think of the quality of these converging lines of inquiry. See if you can give rise to an insight. There's almost nothing that you believe about yourself that arose within yourself completely alone. Think of yourself as a collaborative production dynamic. And just rest your mind in that insight, seeing the truth of it. And then when you're ready, we'll come back together. All right. Any final thoughts or questions, disagreements? It's just some thoughts. And again, there's the workbook that will be available. But this is something that you can think about between now and next week. If it's helpful, I can also post the PowerPoints in the people. So great, I will do. Okay. All right. I'll see everyone in 2 weeks. Thanks for